What's going on, everybody? My name is Nick,
My name is Juan.
and this is the Deep Dive. And we are excited to have Pastor Juan Quintanilla back on the podcast with us on the Deep Dive. He actually had the opportunity to preach this morning. How'd it go?
It went well.
It went well. We think you did a great job as well. So we're going to jump into it. He's got a lot of stuff that he wants to continue to share with us, and I'm excited. It'll be a fun day.
Yes.
All right, let's go.
Well, this morning I was preaching about Jesus' hands. And what I like about Jesus is not too much on theology, but in practical theology, I will say, how he used his hands. So that was the basic message.
Yeah, and you had the opportunity that you brought up a lot of different pictures of hands and just like how he used it in certain spaces and also I thought it was interesting. The first hand you brought up was kind of a worker's hand. You know, it was very
correct.
calloused, like it was doing something. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that?
Well, usually the Bible translate the as a carpenter the working hands, but if you look in the Greek, that word it can translate as a stone.
Stonemason?
A stonemason.
Okay.
So it can go either way. But it seems like the church history go more with the carpenter because of the cross. And so that's the reason we follow that, because it's more romantic being a carpenter than a stonemason. But if you look the example that Jesus gave, he used, for instance, the building of a tower. It was concrete. The other one was the parable when you build a house on the stone. So we can see Jesus uses more example of a stonemason than a carpenter.
Yeah, it's almost like he was kind of telling us through his own experience and stuff like that, kind of the stories he could relate to kind of share with other people.
Right.
You know, something I really enjoyed that you brought up during this part of the sermon is the idea is that if you don't work, you don't eat, and that's kind of how the mentality was back in that day. You know, but it also is a call for us here today to work hard.
Right. So I think when Paul was writing that, he used it because there was a church in Thessalonica that they were waiting the second coming of Christ, but they were waiting without doing nothing, and they were expecting that the church members, all the church, to feed them, just like at the beginning the church was feeding just the widows and the orphans, but there were more super spiritual guys that they were waiting the second coming. They have to be praying all the time, and Paul said, no, you have to work if you want to eat. And so that was a rebuke for that church, and so that was very interesting.
It is interesting. You know, I've heard a couple people kind of combat. I don't know if you've heard a lot of people, spiritualish type people who are like, you just got to sit and wait on God.
Right.
And I heard a speaker one time. He goes, I will wait on God. You know, I will wait for when God shows up. He said, however, I don't think that's a call to do nothing.
Right.
Because he said only a dead fish floats downstream. You know,
Yeah.
otherwise that fish is fighting to kind of stay where it needs to be or whatever. And so that's always resonated with me, is that like, we're not meant to just sit on our hands and just, I mean, maybe even just come to service as our Christian. You know, like we're supposed to be in our communities. We're supposed to be putting our gifts to use wherever God calls us to go there.
Yeah, I'm calling the second mile. You know, the first mile is to walk. The first mile is just to become a Christian, to learn about the gospel, the Jesus. I'm talking about discipleship. But the second mile is get in action. And there are a lot of things to do in the church.
Yeah.
And so we just have to be available.
And that's a lesson, honestly, I think you have shown us very well here is, I mean, you know, it's one thing to preach, but it's another thing to live. And I see you living this one out especially. You know, I don't know if you guys know, but even just in the short time Juan's been here with us, you know, he's helped lead the 40 Days of Sharing campaign, but also he's been working with the jail here in Hickory Flat, the detention center, to become a chaplain. So he's gone through that training and all that stuff because the love he has for community. So I just want to say, like, I see you modeling this, and I really appreciate that about you. And just as if there's anything to learn, it's about go find those gifts, find the things you care about and you love, and show people you love with it. You know what I mean? It doesn't necessarily have to be a chaplaincy thing or whatever, but find your thing. You know what I mean? I think that would be what I would tell people listening.
It's interesting that I'm the only pastor in the chaplaincy.
Yeah.
The 9 or 10 guys who come with me, they're lay people.
Yeah.
Just making time.
So if you're interested, you'll be in good company.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah.
So you went from that, and then you kind of you showed a picture of Jesus touching a guy with leprosy.
Yeah.
Do you want to kind of expand on that just a little bit?
Well, that's very, very commemorative story. There is very touching story because the people who had leprosy in those times, they live isolated, and because people were afraid to get contaminated. And that guy, I can imagine that guy who was touched by Jesus to be clean. If he has a wife, he cannot embrace her. Mm-hmm. If he has kids, he cannot touch them. I mean, he was missing not only his family, but his friends, his work. He was not able to work. He just lived in isolation. And he had the courage to come to Jesus.
Yeah.
And he was very interesting. He didn't say, heal me. He said, if you will, you can heal me. So he was willing, he was asking for his will rather than his power. He said, okay, if you will, you can do it. But if it's no will, I'm willing to accept that. And Jesus, when we got that, he just touched him.
It's amazing. Like there's a few stories similar to this vein throughout the Bible, like the lady who was bleeding and she went and touched his clothes. You know what I mean? Like there's several of these stories, and it's clear that Jesus showed a great amount of compassion when dealing with these people. And I think you said it well, is that these are people that many of us would kind of turn our back on or walk away from because of any other reason. One of the main points you brought up in this section was that sometimes our minds prevent us from being in ministry with some of these people because of what we think about them or what we're afraid other people might think about us as if we interact with them or something like that. And you got to tell. So if you didn't watch Juan's sermon, you can go back and watch it. But you got to tell the story of Mr. C here real quick.
Well, Mr. C he was practically a homeless.
Yeah.
And people who lives in the streets, they don't have baths, they don't have hygiene, they just live in the streets. And it's very hard to see them struggling with that. I'm glad the church has some homeless ministry, but in that time, he was there every Sunday. Every Sunday he was there. And he the way he reacted in the church service, it was crying out loud very high, or saying amen very out loud. I mean, I think he has as well some mental issues. So he was a character because I think God sent us how we respond as a church. Mm-hmm. I think it was a testing because, Jesus said, I was naked, I was in prison, I was a foreigner. So how you treat them, and the message is, hey, I'm with that guy. Yeah. I'm me. I'm Jesus in that person. So when Roger Walker, who was preaching the sermon, he asked the church to interact, and because he asked, you have to lift your hands if you have a need. And so Ms. C was raising the hand, and nobody was approaching to him. And so I didn't want to approach it either, but I had a voice, and I have to struggle with that boy who said, go and pray with him. And it took me a while. I remember how I was dressed. I was with a yellow shirt and a blue jeans. I remember that. I was in the back. And the struggle said, I don't want to go all the church. It was a struggle. But finally, if we don't do God's will, we are we feel merciful. I learned that lesson in the hard way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting when the Holy Spirit kind of puts those little tugs on you,
Yeah.
you know, and you have that moment of like, do I have to, or you know, like I know in my life there have definitely been many times where I can make any excuse, you know, under the sun to be like, no, not me. Like I'm not going to say the right thing, or I'm not going to do the right thing, but you know, every time, you know, that I went out of my way to do it, God bless those moments, bless that person, and so as the story unfolded, you went over, you eventually, in your yellow shirt, your blue jeans, from the back of the church, you walk all the way across, and you ended up praying for him and all that good stuff.
Yeah. The interesting thing, he was not smelling.
Yeah.
He was not smelling, and that was most of the reason. Whereas most of the people were assuming his smell is not good, so they were kind of isolated with him.
Yeah.
So that's the reason it reminds me of the man who has leprosy.
Yeah, and it's kind of just the reminder of what Jesus said. You know, whatever you do to the least of these, you also do to me. So
correct. That's correct.
that's one of those things that, you know, we are called to be in community and to show love to these people. Well, to all people, but especially those.
In those times, leprosy, it was considered like a punishment from God.
Yeah.
From God, and we have several examples in the Bible. First is Marianne. They call her Marianne, the sister of Moses. She was criticizing the leadership of Moses, and then she got leprosy. And then the other example was who was the other one? There is a king. Uzziah king. He was a good king who was doing the will of God, and whatever he did, God was prospering him, and so he built a lot of buildings, but pride caught him.
Yeah.
He wants to become like a priest, and so he wants to offer, you know, in the holy place, and so he crossed that holy place that was limited only to the priest, and he got leprosy, and he died in leprosy. So people related leprosy as a punishment. So can you imagine living with that kind of judgment from the people?
Oh man, and especially as like just feeling so alone, because like you said, people, you'd skirt around these types of people, especially because you're like, oh, they feel punished and whatever. So, I mean, if I were in that situation, I imagine that I would feel like dirt, you know what I mean? Like the worst possible thing out there. And, but that's kind of what's beautiful about Jesus is that he showed these people their value again.
Right,
You know what I
as
mean?
a person.
Yeah.
And sometimes we are with the dilemma. This is the law, and this is the person. And so Jesus chose the person rather than the law. For instance, healing on the Sabbath. I mean, the law said don't do it.
Yep.
And he did it on the Sabbath. And you know, today there are some countries, for instance, I was reading in Sudan, in south part of Sudan, they have a colony of leprosy, like 5,000 people. In India as well, there are some departments of cities in India that you cannot drive, your wife can ask divorce for it, and they cannot work. So it's just,
Wow.
But you know, what was Mother Teresa? When she was working in the streets, she was working with some of them, they have leprosy.
Yep.
So we'll see. We see good examples even today.
A lot of compassion and
Compassion.
And I think you mentioned our homeless ministry, and that is really a ministry directly of compassion. And you know, sometimes it's not easy to find where these people have moved and around, but to try to show them value and that we love and care for them, that we're willing to do a little digging sometimes to find where they're at, and to just provide a warm hoodie or a blanket or socks or just new clothes or whatever.
Right. Just to show the love of God in a practical ways.
Yep. And then that kind of led into this kind of being like a child, that how Jesus had children around him, used his hands to kind of just play and that type of stuff with them. What what would you encourage us to, if we were to live like Jesus in this way, what would you encourage us to do?
Well, children were important for Jesus.
Yeah.
And even though when the Bible talks about the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, the writer of the gospel says, without counting the women and the children. It seems like they don't count in those days. But Jesus was important to focus because the children are the church, and they will be the future of the church. Yeah. And depends how we treat them, they're going to be loving the church or living the church with the time. So they're very important. And I'm glad they have the opportunity to sing today.
I know.
And you will see
you put up
joyful and just doing, besides singing, they were willing to sing with the body.
Yeah. I mean, we saw there was a couple kids kind of jumping up and down and all that stuff.
And dancing too.
Yeah, and I love that you threw that in there too, because, I think, however, if people don't want to hold their hands up and worship, or that's on them, but to have this, to still find a place of joy, to be worshiping Jesus and stuff like that, that is special, and those types of things, when you can just find that joy, like it resonates to the people around you. It almost frees them up to do a similar thing. Is again, it's not about necessarily holding hands up. If that's your thing, go for it. Like, hold your hands up high. If you want to jump, do it. If you want to dance, do it. But it's mostly still about finding those joyful places. And I think you're right. I think children just show us that. And sometimes they're a little too honest about things, but sometimes that's a beautiful thing. Sometimes they're like just so open and willing to have fun. And there are so many times, especially as an adult, where I'm like, I feel like I should be having more fun in this situation. Like it's almost too much business, right? Well, I got to do this and that or whatever. And that maybe sometimes I don't enjoy spaces as much as I should.
And, the kids are very creative as well. Yeah. They were creative as they were, worship the Lord with the hands or with the body. I remember there was a child. They asked the child, "What are you doing?" I'm drawing God. And then the teacher said, "Hey, but nobody have seen God yet." And he said, "They will find out after I finish my drawing." So they have a lot of creativity. But sometimes we just lose it with the time. We conform the society, and then that limits us. Some way, somehow.
So let's have some more fun. Let's be more joyful, all that good stuff.
Right.
So you kind of went from there, and you moved into this space where you were talking. You showed a picture of Jesus helping Peter out of the water as he got, was called out onto the water at that point. And I told you outside here that actually I had an opportunity to preach over at Bascom recently, and this is what I preached on. So this is a fresh topic for me. But what specifically were you kind of pulling out of this?
Well, the fishermen, they were afraid of the sea, even though they go every day, but they don't know if they're going to come back. The lake of Tiberias of Sea of Galilee, they suffer storms, and because of the low temperatures of the Tiberias mountain with the Lake of Galilee. So the heat of the evaporation of the water encounter cold winds, that makes the torment. And in that case, they were afraid. And as the disciples said, they were afraid because they saw a ghost, because they believe in that ghost. And so sometimes our beliefs or our vision is affected by our emotions. And when you are afraid, like they were afraid, because they were tired, they were hungry, because we're talking about the fourth watch was from 3 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock at night. So they were tired, and so when we are overwhelmed, we don't see things that we should. And so, but Jesus was encouraging them. But yet, Peter was willing to get up of the boat. And I think that's a good thing about Peter.
Yeah.
And leaving the comfort zone, start doing things that God calls us to do, like walk on the water.
Yeah.
But we're humans and we're vulnerable, and he starts sinking. But that's life.
Yeah.
That's life. And so, but we know the rescue hand is right there.
Yeah. And that's, as I kind of was going through this study time too, is, they, to get on the boat there, they just left feeding the 5,000 people. So they just saw Jesus do something pretty crazy, and the fact that I think they had like a basket of bread themselves that they were able to kind of take with them and all that stuff. But as they ended up in the water, the wind, the storm, all that stuff, it starts popping back up. And it's almost like, the lesson with the 5,000 is that he can provide for everybody. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
That he can sustain and all that stuff. And it's like they got tested right away of like, does that message work in the middle of the ocean when everything's happening
The
and stuff like
circumstances
that?
were against them.
Yeah. So it's an interesting thing to this whole process is really interesting because, like you said, the spirit. They used to think that ghosts were out on the waters, that there's some evil out there. So
Right.
they see Jesus coming towards them, and they're like, "Oh crap! Here we go. Something bad's about to happen." But I do commend Peter for being willing. In the sermon, I actually argue that maybe he shouldn't have gotten out of the boats, just because of how Jesus responded to him, of calling him, like, why'd you have such little faith and all that. And I know that part of that was the action, but, in essence, the reason they went from one side to the other was to go preach to more people. You know what I mean? So, but it was a good lesson. And I think you're right. I think our faith can be vulnerable. And you really spoke, I think, some real wisdom here of like, our faith can be really strong when things are going really good.
It's easy to believe in God.
It's easy to go, man, I just feel so blessed. I feel so loved. But when you're in that season of darkness, that's always just going to pop up, like a storm just pops up here in this story. You know what I mean? Like stuff happens, and sometimes it's harder in the midst of that to find the same love and hope and feeling of that. But But the beautiful thing we see of Jesus here, and I think you alluded, is that his hand was right there. When Peter felt like he was sinking, falling, he had no hope, Jesus was there to save him. And I think that's such a good reminder of us that, like, even though like we might feel like we're sinking and we're just kind of looking around like what's going to help us, what's going to fix this, is to be reminded to really treat this like he did and just go, Lord, save me, invite him into that space.
A short prayer.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be beautiful. It just, Lord, save me.
I'd say honest prayer.
Yes.
Honest, just go for it.
Go for it. I love that. Honest prayer. So, but it's such a good reminder for us. And I think of just the practical sense of just saying, things might not be great, but that doesn't mean God's not here with me. That doesn't mean God's not going to save me. And so, yeah.
When he sent his disciples to preach the gospel, to the ends of the world, he said, "I'm going to be with you. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be with you." And sometimes we forget about that God is with us.
Yep.
All the time.
Yep.
All the time.
I do want to skip ahead in the interest of time to talk a little bit about Thomas. You had a picture of him appearing back to Thomas, and you talked about how he kind of met Thomas where he was. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, as we remember the story, when Jesus was with his disciples, everyone was there, and they were afraid. That's the reason they didn't come up. But some way, somehow, Thomas was out, and so even though you have 11 witnesses telling Thomas, "We saw the Lord," Thomas was hidden by that.
Yeah.
And I think he was so low that he has to put a condition. I need to touch him. I need to see him, but I need to touch him. And as I say in the sermon, who we are to put some condition to the Lord of Lords, to God. I mean, he was so desperate. He said, "I need to see and touch it." And Jesus was willing to go all the way to the level of the doubts and fears.
Yeah.
And so say, here I am, touch me. If you need that, go ahead and do it.
Yeah. And I think that's so cool. You know, I think just the way you put it, of that he went down to the level of faith of the person he was working with to meet them there. And really, as I was as I've been processing your sermon, thinking through it, as prepping for the podcast, but also just, you know, this is kind of the story of what you're telling us that Jesus does, is he meets people where they're at.
Yeah.
You know, whether they're sinking in an ocean, whether they're on the side of the road and homeless and nobody else wants to, like, that he's willing to meet them right there. You know, meet the children in their fun and their joy. Meet the people who are outcasted in their despair and their loneliness. Meeting people in their need for saving and stuff like that. And you know, that's such a special thing for us that we really have to take hold of, and we have to internalize, because so often, you know, we think, I mean, as humans, maybe it's our tendency, but we do this, you know, I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not wise enough, I don't have enough faith. Well, like we
focus on our limitations.
Yeah, we almost are like, why am I even trying to be a Christian? I can't be a Christian. You know what I mean? But we've also experienced this love of God, and we want to share, but we kind of get in the way of that. But to be reminded that, you know, God just met these people right where they're at. And that's, you know, that's probably just what we need to do, is just go meet them. Like, don't overcomplicate it. Like, just go.
Yeah. There is another example of the Bible. You remember, after they have the experience of the transfiguration, the disciples were that experience, and then Jesus let's go down. And in the valley, they find a father who is struggling with his son, who has some evil spirit possession of that son. And Jesus said, you have to believe. And then the father said, help me to my unbelief.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's us a lot.
Yeah.
Help me in my unbelief, the things that don't make sense. Help me when my prayers feel like they're just hitting a roof and not going anywhere. Yeah, that's good.
I think we have to be honest with God.
Yeah.
As whatever level we are.
Yeah, being honest.
That makes a difference.
Yeah, for sure. Well, friends, there was a lot that we weren't really able to even get to. There was just so much meat to this sermon. So thank you, Juan, for preaching Sunday. Thank you for being here on the podcast with us.
My pleasure.
But if, you know, I would highly encourage you to go back and find the stream on Facebook or YouTube and catch the whole sermon there. There's just a lot to think through and a lot to process ourselves, and I hope you do take time to do that. But as we are here to as we're wrapping up the podcast today, you know, in case you haven't heard yet, our dear friend Juan got reappointed. Not too far away, up in LJ, so he'll still be close. We'll probably see him from time to time, but as sad as we are, it's bittersweet. We're excited for you and all that good stuff. But you know, as you might see Juan around the campus, you know, give him a high five, give him a hug, tell him thank you for all the work that he's done while he's been here. Because it would have been real easy to take 6 months kind of off, you know, be assigned here and just kind of coast and be like, oh, I don't really know what happens here. But kind of like your first point, you just got to work, you know, and you found ways to serve our community, to love on the people of Hickory Flat, both in the congregation and outside. So I just want to say thank you for that.
It has been my privilege and a pleasure being here in Hickory Flat.
And maybe we'll be lucky enough we can get you on the podcast one more time before you get gone.
My pleasure. That would be a privilege.
Absolutely. Well, guys, if you have any questions, any thoughts that you'd like to add, you can drop it in the comments section below on the YouTube or Facebook. But without further ado, we'll catch you guys next time.
God bless you. Bye-bye.
Bye.